Hello, everybody. My name is Jackson Reyes, and back with another episode of Know Your Enemy. I'm joined by Cole Parke of the Kentucky Kernel Sports newspaper, and we're here to break down Florida's upcoming matchup against the Kentucky Wildcats. Cole, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, of course. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So, the Gators travel to Lexington, a place where they lost the last time they were there, and it's going to be an interesting matchup on Saturday. The Gators for the longest time. It was always, close matchups in recent years, but it was almost an automatic victory. The Gators had one of the longest winning streaks against Kentucky in NCAA history with 31 consecutive victories. But now the script flipped a little with Kentucky winning the last two matchups. Going into this matchup, if Kentucky is able to pull off a third straight, it'll be the first time they have won three straight games against the Gators. I think dating back all the way back to 1948 to 1951 when they won four straight over Florida. So, just kicking it off, can you just talk about what this matchup means in terms of either Florida trying to end their two-game skid or Kentucky trying to make some history?
Yeah, it's definitely well known amongst Kentucky fans about that reign of dominance. Very few weeks, other than maybe Tennessee, get as hectic as Gator Hate Week does around here. Kentucky fans certainly are not fans of Florida, to say the least. Um, the fans are going to be showing out in droves. You remember 2 years ago would have been my freshman year when Kentucky beat I believe they were top 10 ranked Florida at the time,
Yeah, I think they were
and
number 10.
rushed the field after that. And I was there. I witnessed that whole thing go down. And winning in Gainesville last year was massive as well. There were celebrations in Lexington that night, even though it was a road match. So I definitely think that both sides are pretty aware of what the stakes are going into it. I mean, Florida, once again, they got a massive win over Tennessee. So they're ranked, they're getting some respect after maybe not having as much ambition going into the season for most casual fans, but now, they're kind of on the map. And once you're on the map, you don't want to get off the map. You want to stay there. So Florida's looking to prove itself, prove that, it is still that same Florida team that can beat Kentucky and doesn't have issues with the Wildcats. And Kentucky is still trying to prove, it's had four straight victories this season, several of them by large margins, but it just hasn't looked super convincing in many of them. It's been a lot of little mistakes. So Kentucky has a lot to prove of itself. There's a lot of questions as to whether or not this Kentucky team can actually perform against, well, respectfully, good opponents. Their opponents so far have been Eastern Kentucky, Akron, um, Vanderbilt, and Ball State. So it's definitely not been the cream of the crop, to say the least. Florida's a team that has been tested against a good opponent. They have the win over Tennessee, and they looked great doing it. So I definitely think that this is a game for Kentucky, it's a game about proving itself that it does belong and that it is still the team that a lot of people hope it can be. And for Florida, it's also about proving itself, but more so proving that, hey, we're here now and we should stay here.
Nice, and I agree with a lot of those points you made. And so, going into this matchup, Florida is, ranked number 22. Kentucky's not ranked, but that doesn't mean it's going to be, an easy matchup for the Gators. So, as of right now, as recording on Thursday night, I believe Kentucky's a 3.5 point favorite. As you mentioned, they are undefeated, 4-0. So, can you just kind of talk about the strengths of this Wildcats team? And, what has helped them succeed so far?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, the defense is always good under Brad White. I think he's a fantastic defensive coordinator. And even times when the defense has had a lot of little mistakes, it seems to still hold itself up pretty well. And, the offense is a big question mark because when the offense is clicking, it looks fantastic. When you got Ray Davis, former Vanderbilt Commodore, you got Devin Leary, former NC State quarterback. When those guys are clicking, they have some great receivers, great backs, good tight ends, great quarterback. The problem is they're not always clicking. And you saw that against Eastern Kentucky, for example, against an FCS opponent. Kentucky went into halftime tied 7-7 because they just couldn't get going on offense. No matter what it tried to do, it just could not get going. But once it did get going, it went on to score 21 points in the second half. So, it's shown that when that offense is clicking, it's very, very good. the defense is usually sturdy. So the strengths are, I don't want to say like the whole team because the whole team hasn't been clicking at both points this year. You saw when the offense started picking it up a little bit against EKU, even the defense started to struggle a little bit. So the strengths in this team really lie in which side of the ball is looking good at that given moment, because so far we haven't really seen them put it together. But the idea that they could put it together, and I know in sports the idea of what could they do is always one of the biggest questions. But this Kentucky team has, I believe, the pieces to be very, very good. It's just going to be about whether or not it can prove that and start clicking together as a unit and not just as individual pieces.
Nice. And, kind of going into the thick of it, obviously I have a lot of questions about the offense, but just starting on the defensive side of the ball, can you talk about the impacts of guys like Maxwell Hairston? I believe he has 3 interceptions, and then also Deion Walker, a really talented defensive lineman. Obviously those two that I mentioned, but anybody else that I haven't mentioned as well who you think are impact players on the defensive side of the ball?
Yeah, for sure. So, little lesser known fact, I suppose, is that Maxwell Hairston recorded 2 pick sixes against Vandy, became the first Kentucky Wildcat in history to
Oh
record
my
two
gosh.
pick sixes in one game. So, massive achievement for him. He's a guy that, I expected to be solid going into this year, but I don't think even I expected how good he was going to be. He's been doing really, really well. You touched on Dion there. Another guy I want to give some credit to is Trevin Diggs. He's been doing really, really sturdy. It's the culture that Brad White culminates in the defense is definitely one of the next man up and just go make a play. So a lot of you talk to any of these defensive guys and they're very, very humble. They're not ones who are going to take a lot of the credit, even after his massive game. Hairston was like, glory to God. I appreciate my team for setting me up to do that. And he wouldn't really take the credit for himself. So the defense in that way is special because you have those guys who have those immense impacts, but also they're not ones who want to take credit, so they're willing to let other guys who maybe aren't as big of names or haven't done as much this year take some of that glory for themselves. um, so it's really really special team-based football in that way.
Nice. And just looking at that defense, obviously, you talk about, their strength is just that next man up mentality and, you know, having guys who are just going to be able to step up and have play as a team. But where would you say the strength is of that defense? Where do you think they excel at most and could give Florida the most problems at come Saturday?
I think Kentucky is sometimes, not always, but sometimes pretty sneaky good on the line, really forcing pressure on a quarterback. Sometimes they struggle a little bit with a quarterback who can run a little bit, but I think they're pretty good at applying pressure. And then you really see the linebackers. I'm a big fan of the linebackers Kentucky has. Maybe each one has their own strengths, but sometimes the corners may struggle a little bit. But if you can get one of those short passes, the linebackers are really, really good. And you combine that with the line who's good at forcing pressure, who might lead a quarterback to try to make a quick, throw to get it out of there. Well, you got those linebackers. So it's really the combination of a strong D line and a really good linebacker group that I think is what makes this team so dangerous. Is that they put pressure on the quarterback, make the quarterback start panicking a little bit to try to make I got to get the ball out of this pocket and hopefully throw it to one of those linebackers.
Nice. And that kind of thing right there could definitely be really important on Saturday. Obviously, battle at the line of scrimmage is always huge, especially in the SEC. But as we've seen from Florida this season, keeping the offensive line healthy and then keeping the offensive line, to give Graham Mertz time to throw the ball has been, a pretty big issue thus far. So switching over to the offensive line of the ball, similarity of Florida Kentucky this year is they both have new starting quarterbacks. They both got them through the transfer portal. So with Devin Leary, who came from NC State, he's impressed in his outings, but just looking at the box score, 9 touchdowns to 5 interceptions. But obviously that doesn't tell you the whole story. So can you just talk about Leary's performance this year to start the season so far?
Yeah, so Leary is a very polarizing guy so far in Kentucky. He's one of those guys that a lot of the fans, are like, I don't know that he's playing super great. I don't know that I think he's struggling, but the numbers seem to indicate he's doing fine. If you really break down his stats, like, some of the advanced stats, some of his numbers, he's doing solid. The big thing is something that I don't think stats track as well, and it's something that offensive coordinator Liam Cohen talked about after EKU, for example, is his confidence. And sometimes, he's maybe not as sure of himself. And you saw that against EKU. He was making some pretty bad plays, to be honest with you. And he just wasn't really sure of himself, but that was something he himself corrected. They didn't pull him aside and talk to him. That was something he himself fixed at halftime and came out ready to play. So I think that one of the biggest things with him is going into such a big matchup, the biggest match Kentucky's played this year. How confident is he going to be in his ability, and how much is he going to trust his team, to make some of those plays? And giving him a little bit of slack too. Some of those interceptions, not all of them, but some of them, I've heard that Will Levis used to throw the ball really, really hard. He had a rocket. Leary does not as much. So you have a lot of these wide receivers who are more used to having to try to catch a rocket, and they catch a normally thrown football. Sometimes maybe they, bounces off their hands. They're grabbing too tight. They're grabbing too hard. And you've seen a couple plays this year where a ball has been tipped up and picked off, which anytime I see a ball get tipped up and picked off, I usually am not going to blame the quarterback for that, because there's not a whole lot they can do once the ball's in the air there. So I don't think all of his interceptions have been his fault necessarily. I feel like a broken record. I said that about Levis as well for the opposite reason, actually. But I think that the biggest thing for him is going to be his confidence and how well he trusts in his team to make plays.
Nice. And then, sort of using that to transition, obviously there have been sort of some question marks about Devin Leary, just about his play, where obviously you mentioned, he's been kind of a polarizing figure, but looking at the rest of this offense, they return a lot of veteran, key players who have, really excelled to start this season. Starting it with Leary's receiver room, guys like Tavion Robinson, Dane Key. I know Dane Key was a guy who played great against Florida last season when they won in Gainesville, had 3 receptions, 83 yards, and the touchdown. Can you talk about the impact of those guys and the sort of threat they could pose against a young Gator secondary?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Tavion, Dane, and then Barryon. Dane and Barryon a little bit more similar, but all three have a different thing they really bring to the table. Tavion is a guy who's a veteran, transferred here from Virginia Tech. I believe he's a 5th year now. And he brings that veteran leadership, that stay calm mentality, don't get too worked up. Very solid, bring the ball down, hold on to it kind of guy. He's going to make you maybe not always a highlight necessarily, but he's going to make some great catches, and he's going to be very, very reliable. You saw that against EKU. I think he had two of the passing touchdowns himself out of the 4. Dane Key was a true freshman last year, had that massive play at Florida, like you mentioned. And, he's another guy who you can most 99% of the time, I'm going to say you can trust him that if he gets his hands on the ball, he's coming down with it, which is really, really important, especially for such a young guy. He's got a promising future ahead of him. And he's really good at it. And then you look at Barryon Brown, same age, was a true freshman last year. Him and Dane Key are really, really close. My assistant, Samantha, actually wrote a lovely feature about it for our football preview about the brotherhood that they have. They both have like matching necklaces they have for each other, and it's pretty cool. They get along super great. Barryon's a guy, though. I mean, you saw it last year in the first game against Miami, Ohio. He got the ball on I want to say it was a kickoff, and he returned it getting up to like 20 plus miles an hour on his return. I mean, he's speedy. He's a guy that'll turn a 5-yard pass into a 12-yard pass, and you'll blink and you miss it. Like, how did he even get there? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, sometimes last year he had a little bit of trouble with some drops. Maybe he has to work on his hands a little bit, but if he gets a hold of that ball, he's going to run with it. And that's when he starts creating some real problems for opposing defenses. But the trick is each one of those you can plan for. Now, planning for all 3 of those at the same time, it's a little bit harder to do. You can try to do everything you can to make sure, all right, we got 2 guys on Barryon. We got this guy watching Dane. Well, now what do we do about Tavion? All right, well, let's move this guy over to Tavion. Well, now Barryon's wide open. So it's very, very tough to guard all 3 of those at the same time. They're not always on the field at the same time, but when they are, you've got 2 guys who you can almost guarantee you're going to bring it down, or one guy who is just going to get way more yardage than he has any business getting off of a standard catch. So I think that, the character those guys have and the special skills those guys have make it really, really tough, and make Kentucky a team that, maybe doesn't always look great on offense, but when it does look great, can really unleash some explosive plays.
Nice. And obviously, Billy Napier, he talked about trying to limit the Kentucky vertical threat in the game. But I think, moving on to my next question, the number one priority from this defense is to try and slow down that Wildcats run game. And so, can you talk about that, which is led by, Ray Davis, who's just an extremely talented running back?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ray Davis is by far the star. Vanderbilt running back last year just absolutely torched Kentucky in the Commodores' first win over the Wildcats in a decade. And then they went on to beat Florida after that. So I guess we're kind of in the same
Yeah.
boat in terms of losing to Vanderbilt last year. But we both saw what Ray Davis can do, and now he's in blue and white, and he's been fantastic this year. He's a guy who is going to get downhill yardage, even more than you'd expect him to sometimes. And he's not in an easy situation either. I mean, inheriting a program where he joins after Chris Rodriguez Jr., the all-time leading program rusher for Kentucky, who in turn joined after Benny Snell, who helped lead Kentucky to a Citrus Bowl back in 2018, I believe. So he comes here on the back of two really, really phenomenal running backs, and he's already been doing really, really good. Wildcat fans love Ray Davis. I remember it was like a little mini party when he announced he was coming here, even though a lot of people kind of figured he probably would. It was kind of rumored for a while, but when he actually committed to Kentucky, it was a big deal for a lot of people. Getting a guy of that caliber, especially knowing you're losing Rodriguez, was massive. But another thing I think Kentucky has a lot of Ray Davis and the other guys. I don't want to diss those other guys, but
Yeah.
you know, you'll see when you look at a box score, Kentucky a lot of times have like 6 different running backs they're using in a game, and like each one of those other ones will have like 1 or 2 carries a piece, but they'll get like 6 or 7 yards, and that's really important. It's kind of like that defensive mentality. We don't always care who's doing it as long as somebody does it. That next man up mentality is also existing in the running back room. We have a new running back coach this year. I wrote a little piece about that when he first joined because we got him when we also got a new offense or special teams coordinator. My apologies. Kentucky switched special teams and offensive coordinators this past offseason. Uh, so far, I think the running back room's looked really, really strong, especially Ray Davis, who, coming in with big shoes to fill, has already done a fantastic job filling those shoes.
Nice. Obviously, that offense poses a lot of threats to a younger Gator defense. So that'll be an interesting matchup this Saturday. So, going into my last two questions, my first one is, you've talked about a lot of the strengths of this Wildcats team. Obviously the Gators come in number 22 team in the country. You mentioned that huge win they had over Tennessee in the Swamp. What could you see being the key difference in this game that could lead to either a Wildcats victory or a Gators win? What do you think those one or two key things that if this happens, Kentucky's going to walk away with a win, or if this happens, the Gators snap the streak?
Yeah, so I touched on a little bit earlier with Leary, but the big storyline this Kentucky team's had this year is the offense just not clicking a lot of the time or really, really struggling. A lot of times you see them come out really, really flat. And I think a team like Florida, maybe you can get away with that against Akron. Maybe you can get away with that against Eastern Kentucky. But I think a team like Florida is really going to punish you if you come out flat. A team like Florida is one that you don't want to get in a hole against because, especially when you get into these good SEC teams, getting in a hole can be all it takes. You saw 2 years ago against Tennessee, it was an offensive shootout for Kentucky. And what ended up being the actual difference in a 48-45 final was Kentucky's defense gave up a field goal right before halftime. So you look at something like that, and that's just a random example I pulled out of a hat. But in the SEC, when you get into these really, really strong teams like Florida is this year, any mistake can cost you. And getting behind, even by 3, can be the difference maker. So I think that a big difference or a big point of emphasis for Kentucky will be coming out and punching the Gators in the mouth early. Because if you let Florida get hot and you struggle a little bit and you don't really get going until the second half, you might already be in too big of a hole to come back from. You talked about a young Florida defense, but you look at the numbers and it's held pretty sturdy. It held Tennessee to 16. The worst it did was 24 against Utah, I think.
Yeah.
But those are strong numbers. I mean, Kentucky is a team that's averaging around like 30 something points a game, but also, like I said, they haven't played a ton of people yet either. So I imagine that's one that'll go down when you get into the Florida, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama that they play this year. So brutal schedule for Kentucky. but yeah, I mean, my big point of emphasis will be how well does that offense come out, and then I would also say how well does Florida attack the UK secondary. Once you get beyond some of those linebackers, a lot of people were pretty surprised when Kentucky corner Carrington Valentine announced he was going to the draft last year. He did end up getting drafted, to his credit, but he was a guy that a lot of people expected to come back for one more year. And we did get a cornerback. I believe that was Hardaway from Cincinnati. And he's very solid, but at the same time, Kentucky's real strength, I think, lies in the linebackers. So once you get beyond that, you might be worrying a little bit. It doesn't matter if you get three stops in a row if you give up a 20-yard play on the fourth down. So explosiveness on the offense and stability on the defense will be the two big points of emphasis for me.
Nice. I can see those being, super huge in this matchup. So, that leads into my final question, which is simply, who do you see coming out on top on Saturday in Lexington, and what's your final score prediction to go with that?
Oof, I knew this was coming, but somehow still I'm not ready for it. Preseason, I know I talked to you and you said you see Florida coming out on top. I said I see Kentucky coming out on top, but looking at what we've seen so far, I would not be surprised if Florida handed Kentucky its first win, just because the Florida defense so far has proved to be pretty sturdy, and the Kentucky offense has not. Now, I could definitely see a scenario in which Kentucky, puts it together finally and comes out firing on all cylinders and wins the game by. I don't see any scenario in which it's not a 1 or 2 score game either way. But I think that Kentucky will probably get itself in a hole a little bit early. Maybe a few field goals. I could see the defense holding strong. The defense usually is pretty sturdy on goal line scenarios, but 3 points are sometimes all it takes. So I'm gonna say based on I'm gonna say 28-21 Florida.
Nice. I can totally see that being the score. As you mentioned, I could see it going either way, but either way, I don't see it being more than a one possession game. So yeah. Again, thank you for joining. Where can people find you?
Yes, so I have a Twitter, Cole Parke underscore WSC, or all of our stories are published on kykernel.com, not KentuckyKernel.com, because that was already taken, unfortunately. So we are kykernel.com. We got our own sports tab. I run the sports desk there. I got my Twitter where we do all of our sports, or at KYKernel Sports on Twitter. You want to plug the brand, I suppose. But I can find me in any of those places. All my stories get published to both sites, so that'll be a great place to find my content.
Awesome. So, everyone tuning in, make sure to check Cole out. Again, thank you for joining me. This has been another episode of Know Your Enemy. Thank you.